Now, the introduction of what this video, the third part of church government, God's government, the introduction here, you saw many ministers within the Church of God, and certainly I guess some of you may be startled by my use of that. Well, the point is that once you've shaped and molded people to accept a certain way, I mean, it's pretty easy to incorporate them into your way of life, and that's what this government issue is all about. You know, now, whether or not you have a single person in charge or you have a group of people like the United Church of God has, it effectively works about the same way. It's still not God's government, even if you have that sort of system in play, because it still acts as a unified voice, and it virtually inhibits the growth of the church also. So anyway, continuing with this article here, the New Testament church is started after Jesus had ascended to heaven in Acts 1, verse 6 through 11. The disciples were together in Jerusalem. As it says in verse 5, Peter stood up and spoke to them. Did that make Peter the head apostle? The account does not say it did. Those who claim this proves Peter was chief minister must read into the account something that is completely absent, and they do this to try to uphold a teaching that cannot be established with biblical fact. In any group of persons, you will have dominant type people who will naturally lead out. Peter was one of those individuals. Many studies today have been done by business firms looking for leaders to prove this human natural phenomenon. Peter was a born leader, as we say. He told the others that someone had to be chosen to replace Judas. That was in verse 16 through 22. And now notice verse 23. And they appointed, emphasis on they, appointed two. It does not say that Peter chose two, or James, or some other chiefs among the apostles, but it says they, the whole, 120 of them, verse 15, chose the two. Now again, like I spoke with my wife, I says, well, they only needed one. Why did they choose two? I says they argue the point that it's top down and one person makes the final decision. Well, it'd be ridiculous for a person to say, well, I need one person, but I'm choosing two. You know, it just doesn't make good sense. You know, they would follow the logical reasoning that, well, I need to narrow my number down to the one I need, not down to the two. But anyway, the account does not tell us how they chose the two men, which the account tells us they. So there's more than one person that made that decision. It says, so that indeed does leave room for some administrative variance within the workings of the church. And people make a big deal about whether they voted or whatever, you know. I mean, you got to come to some sort of consensus. We can call it whatever we want. You know, we're not told. And so I think within some administrative variances, Mr. Hunt talks about it within the Church of God, there's certainly room for that in a limited way. They could not decide which of these two men should take the place in office of Judas. The teaching is clear. No apostle standing up here to tell everyone that he and he alone had final authority to decide the matter. No, there was 120 of them there. In some way, they had to arrive at how they came up with the two. I mean, how do you get 120 different people to agree on one thing? I mean, sometimes it's obvious. And maybe it may have been here, but it doesn't say that. But, you know, somewhere along the line, the 120 had to, by some means, whether it be vote, whatever you want to call it, there had to be some way of knowing. You know, like in the British Parliament, you know, I watch that sometimes, and these people talk, and they are somewhat respectful when someone else is talking, but they do jump up, you know, and a bunch of them might jump up and say something and holler and shoot and shout, you know. Well, I don't know. Somebody has to be able to understand that there is a popular understanding of what needs to be done. So anyway, I mean, somewhere along the line, these 120 had to narrow it down to 2. But anyway, I'll continue on here with what the article does say. The teaching is clear, no apostle standing up here to tell everyone that he and he alone had final authority to decide the matter. And that's what people in the Church of God do. They say, well, they make the final decision. But that's not the way we should be. What did they do? The account tells us they prayed and cast forth lots. As it says, he continues, it is not the purpose of the study to examine what these lots may have been. The reader can avail themselves of the Bible commentaries for such inquiries. Whether this was a voting ballot or pulling the straws makes no difference to the point we want to make here. And that's what I told my wife, is that simply it makes no difference whether it was pulling the straws or voting or what have you. The main thing is they consulted with God before they made a decision, and they beseeched Him to help them make that decision. No one man decided, I continue the article, the issue. Not even 2 or 3 or 4 or some board of persons. The matter and decision to be made was too large and important to be left to one man or a few men. Peter certainly did not have sole authority to decide who would take Jesus' place. Not only that, but once that decision was made, he did not have authority to annul it either. Is this an example that some issues are only for God to decide, and an organization may have to resort to casting some type of lot? Well, yes it is, and then no it isn't. Let me explain. Both men were qualified in the eyes of human beings. They had met certain necessary criterion. Obviously, for whatever reasons, the Holy Spirit was not giving the brethren any clear or obvious mental answer as to which man should take Jesus' place within the 12 disciples. This was a once-in-a-lifetime problem, maybe a once-in-the-life of the New Testament church. This was not an every year or every 10-year occurrence for the Church of God. It was unique. God had chosen the 12 apostles. It was only fitting He should choose the man who would become part of that special company. After all, that man would be given one of the thrones to rule one of the tribes of Israel, Matthew 19. If an issue or situation should arise within a Church of God organization that could be seen as just as important to the one here in Acts, then I say this is an example left for us that could be followed. But then I must seriously question any organization that believes it has a problem as important as choosing one of the 12 apostles and Peter's power. After the Holy Spirit coming on the day of Pentecost, the apostle Peter was very bold in his preaching of Christ. Thousands were converted by his sermons. Great miracles were done by Peter. We can read of all the things that Peter did and said in the first chapters of the books of Acts. Indeed, it's true that Peter did take a leading role in the early days of the church, but is there any word in these first chapters that Peter was chief or had an authority over the other 11 apostles or the whole Jerusalem congregation? No, not one single word can we find in these chapters or anywhere, shall we come to Acts 15 later, in the entire book of Acts, where any apostle claimed he was boss of the rest of them, and they had to comply with his demands and jump to his tune. No. Does having the ability to speak with authority, preach powerfully, do miracles, automatically qualify a person to be the chief or head of the church? If it does, then the Apostle Paul would have been qualified to have dethroned anyone and taken over the church. Look at his record. When some men wanted to boast of their deeds and talents, and others were looking at these men with great admiration, Paul said to the Corinthian church, "Seeing that many glory after the flesh, I will glory also. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more in labors, more abundant, in stripes, above measure, in prisons, more frequently, in deaths often. And that accounts in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 18 and 23. Paul continued to list his deeds for the gospel in verses 24 through 28. He was given visions and revelations of the throne of God. Possibly he was taken up to the throne of the Lord, although he was unsure if it was reality or in the mind's eye vision. Chapter 12, verse 1 through 7. At another time he told the Corinthians he spoke in tongues more than any of them. In 1 Corinthians 14, verse 18. There were times when Paul did great miracles through the power of God's Spirit. Acts 19, 11 through 12. God used him to write 14 books of the inspired New Testament scriptures. The number 14 is the number for deliverance and salvation as used by God in His Word. The number 7 is the number for perfection and completion. The number 2 is for the Godhead, presently only the Father and the Son. Now 2 times 7 equals 14. Paul was used to write not only salvation, but double perfection. With all this, Paul never once wrote that he was the human head of the church, nor did he ever state that Peter or any other man was the head of the church under Christ. The nearest thing we can find in Paul's writings is the acknowledgement that some men were looked upon as leaders and pillars of strength in the Jerusalem church. Then 14 years after, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. I went up by revelation, but privately to them which were a reputation. But of those who seem to be somewhat, notice what Paul goes on to add to that statement. Whatever they were, it makes no matter to me. God accepts no man's person, for they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. And when James, Cephas, Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. And that's in Galatians 2, 1, 2, 6, and 9. And we'll stop there and begin again with part 4.